Every year, a Russian-backed resolution is submitted to the UN against the glorification of Nazism. The outcome is always the same. The US votes against it, and in recent years with Ukrainian backing. Typically, the EU abstains. But with most countries voting in favor, the document is accepted, but it's only advisory. Peter Kuznick, a writer and history professor at the American University in Washington, summarizes the USA's official position.
The United States says that we're not going to prevent freedom of speech. The United States says that even neo-Nazis have the right to speak and to assemble.
A German journalist and filmmaker, Mark Bartelmeier, sees the Ukrainian and US positions differently.
Das würden die Amerikaner niemals würden die das tun, diese Resolution annehmen. Und die Ukrainer schon gar nicht, weil sie würden damit verurteilen, was sie selbst tun.
The modern Western world generally considers Hitler's Nazism to be something atypical of European democracies. The Führer's doctrine on superior and inferior races rather appeared out of thin air in Europe due to an unlucky turn of events. The prerequisites for it had never existed before. But here's the pre-World War map. The UK had colonies in Africa, India, China, the Commonwealth of Australia, Asia, North and South America. France had captured half of Africa and half of Indochina. Belgium possessed Congo. Germany had colonies in Africa, Asia, South America, and Oceania. Italy established colonies in Somalia, Ethiopia, Libya, and Eritrea. There were Spanish colonies in South America and Africa. Portugal occupied colonies several times its own size and population. The USA also kept up with the Europeans. And so, by the early 20th century, most of the world was divided between a few colonial nations. What was going on in the colonies is well known and documented. Millions of ruined lives. Slavery. Ruthless and remorseless exploitation. A former British diplomat, professor of political ideas and author, William Mallinson has studied Europe's colonial system and the reason for its rise and fall.
Only one main thing is important for Nazism, internationally speaking, and that is that nations or that states that are allowed to do anything are the master races. And then you have the minor nations who are the slaves. For the Europeans, the slaves were Indians, Africans. For Hitler, they were Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs.
Nazism is truly convenient. It's a cynical justification for wiping out so-called inferior races and shamelessly robbing them at the same time. Long before the Third Reich appeared, Nazism had been common in the West. There is only one sane and logical thing to be done with a rarely inferior race, and that is to exterminate it. H.G. Wells, English author.
All these racial ideas and anti-Jewish ideas were circulating everywhere in Europe, and this led or helped to so-called justify the grabbing of other people's resources around the world, including what is today the United States of America. And has anything altered? Only the colors.
I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America, a stronger race. A higher grade race has come in and taken their place. Winston Churchill. The second quote refers to the genocide of Native Americans that continued for around 300 years. About 90% of the continent's indigenous peoples were wiped out. Counter-terrorist expert and former US Army analyst Scott Bennett investigates crimes against humanity.
The American Indians were seen as a scourge, as a social pariah that needed to be expunged, expelled, and exterminated from much of the eastern seaboard.
The elimination of so-called inferior races and extermination camps were typical of the West. Hitler had hardly come up with anything new. Bloemfontein, 1901, British concentration camp. Mauthausen, 1945, a Nazi extermination camp. The Western world did fairly well, living off exploiting its colonies.
The British Empire was extremely profitable for the British. The French tried to copy.
In his books and articles, Paul Craig Roberts, professor of economics and well-known journalist and former US Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy, analyzes the economic factors destabilizing the world.
I don't think that we can attribute European colonialism to anything other than money-making. The sun never set on the British Empire. The colonies were everywhere, and this empire is far, far older than the Nazis.
I like the British people. Their colonial policy was unthinkable. Adolf Hitler. Fascism is always attributed to the Third Reich, without mentioning how other countries contributed to the idea.
System des Faschismus, Staatsräson. Der Begriff Faschismus geht auf den italienischen Begriff facie zurück, was so viel wie Bündel bedeutet. Also die Bündelung von Macht, wirtschaftlicher und politischer. Halb Europa war faschistisch. Franco in Spanien, ein rein faschistisches Regime. Portugal war faschistisch. Rumänien war faschistisch. Ungarn war faschistisch. Frankreich hatte eine faschistische Kollaborateursregierung, die Vichy-Regierung. Deutscher Faschismus während seiner Entstehung sehr stark auch unterstützt worden aus den USA.
Finanziert, gefördert hat Hitler oder wurde Hitler vom nationalen und internationalen Kapital.
In his books, Anton Letzow, a history professor, gives a thorough analysis of the reasons that brought Germany to war.
Die deutsche Industrie, vor allem die deutsche Rüstungsindustrie, wurde aufgebaut mit Hilfe der amerikanischen Monopole.
A lot of elements in Britain and France and the United States were pro-fascist, sympathetic to Hitler and to Mussolini. American business was in bed with the Nazis throughout most of the 30s and into the early 40s.
The Standard Oil Company sent crude oil to the Germans on a monthly basis and collaborated with IG Farben, the conglomerate that produced the Zyklon B gas used against people sent into the gas chambers. About half of Wehrmacht vehicles were produced by Opel, which was owned by the American company General Motors before 1940. Ford supplied the German army with motor cars and crude rubber. In July 1938, for his support of Nazi Germany, the American manufacturer, Henry Ford, received the Third Reich's highest possible award for a foreigner, the Order of the German Eagle.
Hitler sagte 1931 über Ford, ich zitiere Hitler, ich betrachte Henry Ford als meine Inspiration. Und Himmler 1924 schon. Ford ist einer der wertvollsten, wichtigsten und geistreichsten Vorkämpfer.
Die NSDAP wurde also stark finanziert, auch aus den USA, unter anderem von der Bank of America. Dort namentlich von einem Herrn Bush, dem Urgroßvater von George Bush, auch US-Präsident, alteingesessenen Familien in den USA, die ein Interesse daran hatten, dass Europa und auch die junge Sowjetunion in einen Krieg gestürzt werden.
The 20th century saw a confrontation between two opposing systems, capitalism and socialism. The example of the Soviet Union that proclaimed equality of all nations and all classes of society posed a threat to capitalism.
The United States and Great Britain were equally suspicious of the Soviet Union. It was communism. It was seen as a direct threat to the democratic capitalist systems in the West. And so they were as uneasy with the Soviet Union as they were with Germany.
1938. The Austrian Anschluss. The partition of Czechoslovakia by Germany, Poland and Hungary. The beginning of World War II. Having realized the danger in March 1939, the Soviet Union proposed an anti-fascist alliance to Western countries.
The Soviets have been trying to rally the West, make a stand with them against fascism. They opposed Munich. They opposed allowing Hitler into Czechoslovakia, but nobody would do that. So it wasn't just in 1939 when the Soviets proposed an alliance with Britain and France against Hitler. It had been actually throughout the last half of the 1930s that the Soviets were pushing for that. Had that happened, we could have stopped Hitler. We could have prevented the Holocaust. We could have prevented World War II, because Hitler was weak and knew he was weak, and he was bluffing and assuming that the West was not going to stand up to him, that the West was hoping, and many elements in the West were hoping, that he was just going to go east. And so in the 30s, the Soviets are the ones who are most strongly opposed to the Nazis.